Hello. So this video is going to be a performance review of John Cleese's stage adaptation of Fawlty Towers, which is, of course, a reworking of some episodes of the original 1975 to 79 television sitcom, written originally by John Cleese and Connie Booth. The stage version was adapted by John Cleese, which itself is a kind of interesting thing to me. And the production on the West End in the Apollo Theater was directed by Caroline J. Ranger. Caroline, I'm not sure. Sorry. Anyway, it's a fascinating show. And it's sort of fascinating for me individually to go because I am familiar with the show. I've watched it a few times, not for a few years now, but I've watched it enough that I was able to basically identify what the trajectory of the different beats in this show were. So any individual portion of the show, any individual portion of the stage production, I knew the TV show well enough that I could tell you what was going to happen. And I think that was the case for probably the bulk of the audience, because as one of my students here for the Literary London trip pointed out, many people in the audience were laughing in anticipation of the joke that was about to come. Whereas most of and our field director, Mike Grundman, he is very familiar with the show. He's British. It's part of his cultural heritage. But the majority of our students on the Literary London trip either knew very little or nothing at all about Fawlty Towers. And so it was very interesting to sort of go and be in this audience where the majority of people attending seemed to be British, seemed to be older, and so they would have that knowledge and that recognition of Fawlty Towers as a cultural property, whereas the students that I brought on this trip, did not have that knowledge. So it was a new experience for them, a new cultural artifact. So what I find really fascinating about the play is that it is almost a direct facsimile of several episodes. They're not sort of directly played out. They do draw together bits from various episodes in some cases, but there's not really new language. There's no new plot structures. There's not really new jokes. Everything is a repurposing, almost a kind of collage of material from the original TV show. And that's interesting. And as well as that, along the same lines, the performances were very much aiming to reproduce the characters, the mannerisms, the style, the voice, the tone of the original cast. So Danny Bain, for instance, played Basil Fawlty. And I guess in case you don't know, the absolute sort of basic foundation of this, Basil and Sybil Fawlty, a married couple, run Fawlty Towers, which is a small hotel in Devon. Basil is very sort of curmudgeonly and misanthropic. He spends his time arguing and critiquing the guests, and he's henpecked by his wife in this very 1970s sitcom way, et cetera, et cetera. And he sort of struggles with, especially Manuel, who is their sort of waiter from Barcelona, who doesn't speak that much English, and so there's communication problems, et cetera, et cetera. But Bain, who again played Basil Fawlty, looked very much on stage, at least from where I was in the gallery, fairly far away. Maybe if you were in the front row or something, this was apparent more that it was not John Cleese. But he looked very much like John Cleese. He moved like John Cleese. He spoke in the same sort of tones and inflections that Cleese speaks in the show. The same thing with Mia Austin, who played Sybil. She very much reproduced the character from the TV show. Again, it was almost like a facsimile of the show. So a facsimile, right, is a reproduction of a thing. Now, what I find really fascinating about that, and what I find really fascinating about that is the question of why you would do that, right? So, and we were discussing this on the train back afterwards. Why not write new material? Why not create new scenes, new plots, new conflict, whatever it is, rather than just repeat what's already been done? And I think because one of the things that some of the students were saying was you could draw in a new audience who don't necessarily already know Fawlty Towers or who don't have that sort of nostalgia element. You could draw in a new audience by creating new material. Give us something we haven't seen before so that we have an incentive to go and see it alongside things that we have seen before that would still draw that nostalgia factor. And I think in some ways that's not a bad argument. But I think the sort of question becomes, what is it that particularly Cleese wants out of this? And partially his own, I think, sort of position drives the way that this production works. But I think the sort of vicissitudes of theater under capitalism drive a big part of how this production works. Because it is about nostalgia, right? That is the big selling point of something like Fawlty Towers. It's such an iconic piece of British culture, of British heritage, of whatever it is, so many people's individual lives, that I think there's a clear element of we are trying to sell tickets to people who love this intellectual property, who love this cultural artifact that is this 1970s sitcom. And if that's your intended audience, then the way that you do that is not by giving us something new, but by giving us the same thing that we already know, right? And this is one of those things, like, there is comfort in recognition. This is why so many of us, me in particular, I love watching the same things over and over and over again, but why so many of us find comfort in watching, rewatching, rereading, etc., etc. Why we listen to the same song over and over and over again is because it is familiar, and that familiarity creates a kind of comfort. At the same time, there are more sort of individual components that I think would have driven John Cleese personally to have kept this very static, right? Very much the show of the 70s. So one is that while Cleese was not the solo author of this, he was a co-author of the original TV show. The show itself is very clearly a John Cleese vehicle. So, I've forgotten her name. Connie Booth, sorry. So Connie Booth played Polly in the original. So she was also in it as a co-author, but it's clearly a show about Basil Fawlty. He is the protagonist. He is the person who drives the action of the majority of the plots. He is the one who creates the conflict, etc., etc. Everybody else, every other character sort of orbits Basil Fawlty. And so in that sense, for Cleese to sort of adapt this is to take a thing where it's very clearly centered on him, as opposed to something like Monty Python or Cleese's other roles for which he is famous, that where he is not necessarily the standout star. With something like Fawlty Towers, he clearly is the standout star, the central figure. And so, I mean, Cleese's stock has fallen somewhat in the past several years as he has gotten more toward the sort of, free speech means comedians should be able to say offensive things and no one should cancel them. Cancel culture is terrible. Woke culture is terrible. All this bullshit. He's moved towards that, not as overtly and aggressively as some aging comedians and celebrities and stars, but to the point where his stock as a performer and a public figure has fallen somewhat. And so there is a sort of, I think there's some element of wanting to revivify this intellectual property in which clearly centered on him. And I mean, we know this generally. There's some degree of narcissism to celebrity, and I'm sure John Cleese experiences that as well. I don't know that for sure, and I don't know how much that's a driving element of his personality, but I assume that it is there by virtue of pursuing stardom. There's also a sort of anti-woke element to this in that the type of person that a figure like Basil Fawlty really is going to appeal to is a sort of small Englander, very sort of provincial, very sort of like there's a bit that gets incorporated where Basil is critiquing the European common market, which Britain entered into around that time. I forget when that episode specifically came out, but like being part of Europe it now has a slightly different feel in a post-Brexit era during which the United Kingdom, particularly England outside of major cities like London and Manchester, and Wales. England and Wales outside of major cities really voted to take the United Kingdom out of Europe and sort of forced Scotland and Northern Ireland along against their objections. So there is that sort of, again, small Englander mentality. And one of the things that Mike pointed out, our EF tour guide, is the show is not just playing in London. It's doing a massive tour of the UK and going to these small towns, local communities, et cetera, that normally a show, especially a sort of a West End type show, would normally never, ever go to. But you go to places that embrace the sort of small Englander mentality, and this is broad generalizations, of course, that Basil Fawlty sort of represents, and people are likely to be looking for them, right? So there is that sort of sense of, oh, this is anti-woke, this is from when entertainment was good, this was solid British entertainment, etc., etc. And that the other thing that really fascinates me about that is this sort of question of this play as a cultural artifact, because the original TV show is a cultural artifact of the 1970s, again, 75 to 79. And so you watch the show from today's perspective, and you say, yeah, a lot of the things that are being done here, the sort of anti-feminist presentation of the shrewish wife, the physical abuse of a wait staff person who does not speak English, the casual sort of ageism, sexism, whatever it is, all of that stuff is problematic. But it's from the 70s, and in the 70s, these things were more acceptable to make jokes about. And so you give it some leeway. You say, yeah, today we would prefer not to say these kinds of things, to make these kinds of jokes. But it's an artifact of its time, and it does what it does. And we can criticize it for what it does, but it does what it does in its context. But it raises very interesting questions about the stage show, because the stage show is not an artifact of the 1970s. The content ends up being an artifact of the 1970s, but I think this is quite a recent one. Let me see if I can find this real quickly. 2016 seems to be the year that Cleese reworked the theatrical version. In 2016, it would have been quite clear to people that things like physically hitting a member of your staff, the sort of the kinds of sexist jokes, racist jokes, the sort of Nazi marching parody that Basil Fawlty does at one point, that these things would not really be acceptable. They would not really be the kinds of jokes that you would make in 2016 or in 2025. And so it raises this sort of interesting question, because this isn't just a copy. It is a copy at the level of content to a certain degree. It's not a direct copy, but you know what I mean. But it's also copy that has been artistically constructed at a much later date. And so the question becomes, do we say of the stage play, well, it's an artifact of the 1970s, even though it isn't, even though the stage play was created in 2016? Do we say it remains an artifact of the 70s because the original material, all of the material that is being rearranged in 2016, comes from the 70s? And so do we extend it that grace? Or do we say this is trying to make jokes that are now regarded as inappropriate under the guise of nostalgia?